Hi, and welcome to Kairos Corey, a podcast where time is relative and anything can happen. I'm Mary Helen, your host and guide through this time travel adventure, and I want to welcome you to the first episode of my new podcast. I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about me. I'm the award-winning author of Badge City Notches, which won Best Novella in the 2016 Pulp New York Pulp Awards. I'm a writer for 18th Wall Productions, including a weekly column for the website and the upcoming mystery anthology All the Petty Myths in the following book series. I'm also the television coordinator for the Time Travel Nexus at timetravelnexus.com. So what is the Time Travel Nexus? The Time Travel Nexus is a site where its goal is to become a time travel hub here on the internet. We're hoping to have books, movies, TV show, podcasts, blogs, video games. If it has time travel in it, we're hoping to eventually make sure it has a reference on our site. It's a big goal and we're working towards it, and the site just started, I believe, in December of 2015, might have been January 2016, and it's come a long way in just a few short months. And according to Phil Hornshaw and Nick Hurwitz, writers of So You Created a Wormhole, A Time Traveler's Guide to Time Travel, I'm the one nerdy girl who's not only willing to pick up a book like that, I'm willing to spend a lot of time talking about it. Let's take a second and actually talk about this book, So You Created a Wormhole. It is a guide to time travel, Time Traveler's Guide to Time Travel, as the title says. These two time travelers from the futures, heads of quantum, are giving this guide to the next or first, depending on how you want to look at the timeline, generation of time travelers so that one might manage to survive, including a handy survival reference guide in the back of the book. It's actually a fun read. I just reread it last week. It came out in 2012 and I read it shortly thereafter, and I've just recently reread it. And it's fun. It has fun theory, good ideas, different references, Back to the Future, Doctor Who, Quantum Leap gets referenced, and the random Pokemon reference that just made me so happy inside. It's a lot of fun, and I think you should check it out. I'm going to be mentioning it a lot on this podcast because it is a good guide to time travel, and it has some fun reference points. Not only do they make references, but they make some good points, and it's fun to argue or discuss and agree with different points they make, and it's also a good starting point for some of these theories. Today we're going to talk about one of those topics that is often talked about, rarely agreed upon, and probably will be continued to muse until mankind actually achieves time travel, and then we'll still argue about it. The flexibility of time. Going back to So You Created a Wormhole, they actually include a list of 4 different theories on the elasticity of time. And I'm going to briefly mention those because all 4 are worth noting, and we're actually going to compare and contrast these. I'm going to tell you my thoughts on them later in the show. And we're also going to compare them to how different TV shows that are airing currently use them, or aired previously, because we do have one that is currently off air. Number 1 is the universal theorem of the universe preventing you from destroying said future. This one is time takes care of itself, and when someone tries to do something to change it, potentially ruining the future or in their perspective possibly present, time fights back hard. A good example of this is the Hulu original series 11/22/63, where they go back to attempt to stop the assassination of JFK. And one of the big selling points of this is how often time fights back. We'll be discussing this more in a bit. While the authors are calling this theory unpopular, in 2012 it actually was an unpopular theory. In the last 6 months or so, it's gained extreme popularity, partially because of 11/22/63 and also because of the DC Universe introducing time travel into 2 of their shows, The Flash and Legends of Tomorrow, and they take the universe fights back is very rigid in its time travel. We'll see with the addition of 4 new shows in the fall where they fall on the spectrum, if some are going to take DC's example or forge their own path and fall possibly somewhere in the other 3. Which takes us to number 2, the elastic form-fitting waistband of time. They make a joke in the book about talking about how after Thanksgiving dinner you feel like you need elastic pants as you go out Black Friday shopping after having 1, 2, maybe 3 meals. So much turkey, so little time. And here they're talking about how space-time reacts to any change in an instantaneous and complete manner, so no one notices the change at all. So, for example, if you happen to murder your own grandfather, dust wiping yourself out of the timeline, you're gone like that, and no one's gonna notice, which means you shouldn't wipe yourself out because there's no chance to fix that puppy. It's a very final form of time travel. Going to number 3, time part 2, the revenge. When you go back, for example, they use buying stock, I believe, in Google. If you go back to 1990 and say, hey, I want to tell my mom to buy stock in Google so I'll have boatloads of money here in 26 years. And she does. You're going to diverge from timeline A, where she hadn't, to timeline B, where she had, possibly have that boatload of money. But timeline A is gone unless you go to what they call the Marty McFly close enough situation, and you revert the timeline after you've already changed it. One recommendation they do make is, if you are bright enough to do this, we'll use the word bright here, that you have to wait and actually let yourself change it, let yourself go back, and then come in and change it again. Because otherwise there's another paradox on top of a potential paradox, and one can only have but so many paradoxes before the timeline gets a little cranky. And then the fourth is the multiverse theory. And this one is not a unique take on the multiverse, and I like how they approached it. But at the same time, it's one I do not completely agree with, and I'll discuss this more in a bit, why I don't agree with it. But every time you travel through time, you're actually traveling to another universe. Because keep in mind, with the multiverse theory, one can believe that there's an infinite number of universes or parallel worlds. Both are used separately, interchangeably, depending on your definition of the two. And chances are you're not changing your timeline, the one you just came from, you're changing one of the infinite number of other ones. So, vice versa, chances are when you're like, okay, I'm done changing this and go back, you might not be returning to your original timeline. You might be returning to another one of the infinite numbers, since infinite means a lot. Alright, having covered the four theories that the authors use, we're going to actually move in and look at some of the popular shows, starting with BBC's Doctor Who. Doctor Who uses a web of time as their sense of how to keep time in place. It was created by the Time Lords. This web holds fixed points and specific planets, three notable ones being Gallifrey, Skaro, and Earth, together. After the Time War, which happens between the 1996 8th Doctor movie and the 2005 reboot of the show, this is all but non-existent, leaving the universe in New Who extremely flexible, which is how the Doctor gets away with some of the stuff he gets away with, because technically he's the only Time Lord left, and the web of time is at its weakest point, with Earth now becoming its focal point, which is why so much comes to London. And technically in season 2 we have people realizing aliens exist. That might not have happened had the Time Lords been there to intervene, which would have been ironic since they're non-interventionist. So what is the web of time? When trying to figure out a good answer for this one, I actually had to go to the TARDIS wiki and read their article, and they had a fun quote from the 8th Doctor audio Neverland. It could not exist until Rassilon built the Eye of Harmony and used it as what has been described as the hitching post of chronology. More or less, this is saying that it was created by Rassilon, and it creates the cause and effect in the Doctor Who universe, forcing chaos into an alternate dimension. More or less, this could also give Rassilon and the Time Lords the ability to say, well, this species can develop, this one can't. This one can have time travel at this point, well, this one can't. One could say that the temporal powers that are referenced in the audio series Gallifrey, if the Time Lords had really been in the mood, could never have happened. Yet they do allow them to develop into temporal powers, and eventually there's 5 at this point. This is pre-Time War, and eventually down the road, Earth would develop temporal powers about, I want to say 30th century, but I could be off on that one. So what is a fixed point? Because I've mentioned that a couple times. A fixed point is a point in time that has to happen in order for the timeline to proceed. Some good examples are Pompeii, which we see in the Fires of Pompeii, the Doctor Who episode with Ten and Donna. JFK's assassination as displayed by the web show Hulu original 11/22/63, and the sinking of the Titanic, which Supernatural displayed in the episode My Heart Will Go On. As we know, the Time Lords were infamous for their policy of non-interference, but even a certain renegade Time Lord wouldn't mess with a fixed point in time for anything short of a predestiny paradox, as we saw in the Fires of Pompeii, where Ten realized that he's the one that actually sets off the volcano because it becomes Pompeii or the world. Going back to another previously mentioned audio drama, Gallifrey, we spend some time in what the Time Lords refer to as the Axis. The Axis is where Time Lords store divergent timelines, ones that went too far away from what they deemed the primary timeline. We actually spend season 4 going in and out of alternate Gallifreys, and it's a fun, fascinating idea. There is one where they're interventionists, and to Romana, who is in the primary timeline, seeing an intervening Gallifrey was horrifying. And then there's another one where there's ironically a lot where Romana still stays president. You've got some where the Doctor never leaves Gallifrey, some where he leaves and comes back and stays, which we know he never does. It is definitely worth a listen, and you will find yourself falling in love with characters you never imagined you'd fall in love with. So I do recommend you check out the audio series Gallifrey. It is the best idea to get an idea of the Time Lords, how they view and operate in time, and get an idea of what the Doctor's home planet is like. Because prior to this, and since with the destruction of Gallifrey and the Time War, our view of Gallifrey is limited because, as we know, the Doctor's not one to hang around his home planet. In fact, he was elected Lord President and proceeded to flee, maybe because he forgot that he actually was now president. Good job, Doctor. Another note here is with fixed points that we do see the 10th Doctor break, and he has a moment where he realizes that the so-called rules of time, the web of time, is technically his to control, because as the last Time Lord, who's to stop him? Time itself, the web of time, fixes itself. Someone kills himself on Earth instead of being on Mars, more or less writing the timeline, allowing the future to proceed, allowing her granddaughter to help develop space travel, deeper space travel and move Earth towards its future of the stars, the third, second, fourth great human empire that we saw in previous and post episodes of Doctor Who. And oftentimes, I've found it funny that the Doctor, when he helps out, when he intervenes, it's often because he notices something's not right in the timeline. A good example of this is the game station and later the news station and then the game station. Granted, one was because of his interference in the other, but that's another story for another day. His changes work, and if time is not fighting back, it's actually, letting him right it, which leads me to believe that time in the universe is flexible within the constraints of the web of time. That does give a guiding principle to the Doctor, as well as other timelines when they existed, on how time worked. Another good example of a unique structure is Quantum Leap, and I'll admit, I haven't watched. I've heard a lot about this and plenty of good things, and it is on my list to get to. But Quantum Leap has an odd system with Dr. Sam Beckett. He can only go back in time within his lifetime. There is apparently an exception episode where he does go back to the Civil War and his great-grandfather, but otherwise he's within his own lifetime and he occupies the body of another. This, to me, is a rather rigid system of time because you were limited to 30, 40 years and you can only change something within that one person, within that one person's timeline. It, to me, is very constraining. And this might partially be due to the experiment that started setting him back in the first place. Had he been able to finish and develop this system properly, maybe Quantum Leap's universe and their time travel elasticity would have been different. But as we have it, that's what we had. As we've already talked about 11/22/63, they outright say they're rigid. In episode 1 and many, many times thereafter, they mention the past will fight back, time will fight back. Even the tiniest change, for example, Jake picked up the phone and tried to call his father. We don't necessarily know the story between him and his father and why he felt the need to do that in 1960, but he did, and time threw a fit. Just something little as him picking up a phone. So how he manages to get from 1960 to 11/22/63, all power to Jake. But beyond calling it a rabbit hole, 11/22/63 doesn't explain its time travel mechanics. Somehow, Jake is able to get from the present day to 1960 through this diner. He can't get to any other point but October of 1960, of all places. But it works for the constraints of the show. That saying, they are definitely with the first theory from So You Created a Wormhole. They are time will fight back, time will fix itself, and sometimes even in surprising ways. Moving to another one that more or less goes with this first theory is the DC universe, starting with DC's Legends of Tomorrow. This recently aired show is a lot of fun, even though I started making the joke that the entire first season is more likely just going to be one giant paradox in the making. Rip Hunter claims early on that time is rigid and that time will fight back and won't let them change, including not only everyone's past, but technically for the next 100 years or so, it's also Rip's past. So even that will try to fight back and change and stay to what Rip knows. When they go to make changes, sometimes Gideon, the AI on the ship, tells them they've gone too far and then they have to rewrite the timeline. They fix their own mistake. Once again, going to what So You Created a Wormhole refers to as the Marty McFly close enough. While their changes rarely help them towards the goal, once again mentioning this goal is a giant paradox in the making, which I am interested to see how the show addresses that, because we're hitting a point where they're going to have to start addressing it. They seem to be able to change the timeline with relative ease. Beyond the glaring paradox, are we actually going to see incidents of time itself fighting back? Because the main interference is other time travelers, Kronos the bounty hunter, or the Time Masters trying to stop their renegade former member, who believes that he's in the right to fix time and save his wife and child. But time itself doesn't fight back, the past doesn't. It's other people from the future, which makes me argue why Rip says that in the beginning. We haven't seen exact evidence of it. But another DC show does show an example of this, so with that, we're going to talk about The Flash. Until the episode Flashback, which aired the day after the Supergirl Flash crossover, time seemed pretty flexible in the Flash universe. You could have an argument of a predestiny paradox being in play, but besides that, it was pretty flexible. Here in season 2, it gained a bit of hardness to it, which makes me question, is it trying to properly join the DC universe? Besides the Arrow Flash crossover, they were more or less staying separate, but now with Legends of Tomorrow joining the two and characters coming in and out of the 3 shows, they maybe have to be a little bit more cohesive in joining. In season 1, Barry traveled back to the night his mother was murdered, and while he attempts to consider trying to save his mom, another Barry stops him and lets events play out. Take a second to note that the first law of time is broken multiple times here. That not only is there 11-year-old Barry, there's Barry that we know in season 1, and then there's another Barry, so Barry eventually is going to have to come back to this night again. There are 3 Barrys in the same time-space coordinates, yet we don't get nearly the reaction we get when he went back about a year in time. In the previous timeline he traveled, one could argue that it is a predestiny paradox, that he has to be there. They see evidence in season 1, and Barry agonizes this for about half the season. He has to go. Yet here in season 2, when he goes back, all of a sudden he's almost attacked by time wraiths. Arguably, I'll give them that, because they might have just been stopping plain old stupidity, because Barry kind of went back on a whim. It's like, oh, I need to learn how to run faster. Let me go back to my old mentor, who actually was the main bad guy of season 1, because he can tell me how to go faster. Let's not actually take a moment to think about this. I'm just gonna take off now and go. So then the time wraiths came to try to write the timeline. A good comparison, Cisco jokingly calls them Dementors from Harry Potter. Another good comparison to me were the Reapers, as we saw in the Doctor Who episode Father's Day. More or less all trying to cleanse and correct the timeline. Well, not the Dementors, but the other two. Time travel in The Flash is directly reliant on Barry's ability to go fast enough. Around Mach 2 is what the show uses. From there, he can travel to arguably to any point in the past or the future. We have a joke here that someone would like to go to the 1898 World's Fair in Chicago and have a nice discussion with Nikola Tesla. Who wouldn't? That'd be a lot of fun. Then we're going to learn here in season 2 that not only can he traverse time, he can play around with the multiverse. But that's actually faster, up to Mach 3, to cross that barrier. I'll admit, and I said early on in the show, that I don't completely agree with any of the theories, and so you create a wormhole. In fact, I kind of combine some. I like the idea of the divergent timeline because it is extremely accurate. Going back and changing something, you're not going to have the original timeline, because that change is now going to reflect in your life, no matter how small or big, due to the butterfly effect. That to me is completely valid. I take a much more flexible view than the DC universe on 11/22/63, and occasionally grates my nerves how rigid they are. I'm like, where's the fun in that? So you can't go back and change anything? But before we get into that, let's take a second and talk about the multiverse, because that has been mentioned several times. What exactly is the multiverse? Merriam-Webster defines it as a theoretical reality that includes a possibility of infinite number of parallel universes. Another fun thing to note about the multiverse is its first use is said to be in 1963. Do with you will with that information, but I'll admit I had a good laugh over that. Saying that going back, though, and sending yourself to a parallel or an alternate timeline or dimension, where's the fun in that as well? As we go to time part 2, the revenge, the third theory from So You Create a Wormhole. To me, that's no fun. You're just going back to an alternate one. It has no effect on yours. And as a result, you might not make it back to yours. To me, that's not only a little depressing, it takes half the fun out of the idea of time travel. I do think that in order for time travel to work, there has to be a working theory of the multiverse. There has to be parallel worlds, alternate dimensions, and I also do think there has to be fixed points in time. But I think you can have the ability to alter the current timeline. Granted, it will now become a divergent timeline from the original one, and you will be the only ones who know the difference. With the premise of a multiverse and fixed points in time, to me, there's no reason time can be flexible, and with the right technology, I don't see why it can be changed. That being said, that doesn't mean you should change it. To this point, then I start to agree with the Time Lords. Yes, let's go time travel, but why are we going to intervene and change things? You're sitting here with the ability to have a front row view to history. You could go get the picture of a lifetime in Appomattox, Virginia, in 1865. There were no reporters there because everyone was still in Richmond and Petersburg, where all the action was, and this contingency had come in through Appomattox heading down towards Danville, Virginia. No one has dared to get that picture, so now we're all guesswork. Even the most so-called accurate painting, we're not completely sure how accurate it is because there was no camera. You can get the picture of a lifetime. You can go to the Roaring Twenties and dance, swing, have fun, go to Golden Hollywood and its height. You can go and visit the turn of the century, go back to Y2K and just have a good laugh at everyone freaking out. Go hear the Beatles. Yes, that is on my time travel bucket list. Go sit there. The American Revolution, Shakespeare, front row of history. There's nothing wrong with time travel, but why are we necessarily, everyone saying, oh, if I go back, I'd want to change this. Most of my items on the bucket list, if I go back, I want to see this. Granted, I do have an item, and we'll talk about it eventually on my time travel bucket list that does technically violate the first law of time, and I'll admit I do have it. It's not necessarily changing something, it is leaving a piece of information in the past. That's all I have for the topic today. I want to take a second and thank my sponsor / co-producer, award-winning publishing house 18th Wall Productions, who produce literature like you've never known. And I want to take a second to let you know where you can find me on social media. I'm on kairoscorey.tumblr.com, on Twitter at kairoscorey, on Facebook, facebook.com/kairoscorey. I'm also on YouTube, and don't forget to rate and review on iTunes. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll see you down the timeline.